When King George III reigned, Britain ruled seas and empires, and his home overflowed with princes and princesses. 15 children filled the royal nursery, 13 would live to adulthood. Some would sit on thrones, others would fade quietly into drawing rooms or die without heirs. Together they formed one of Europe's most sprawling royal networks, and yet few today could name even 3 of them. This is the story of all of George III's children, their births, their paths through war and marriage, their fates, and how, through 2 surviving lines, their blood still flows in modern palaces from London to Hanover. In 1 hour, we will trace each life from cradle to legacy and discover what truly happened to the king's many sons and daughters. On August 12, 1762, Queen Charlotte delivered her first child at St. James's Palace in London. The infant prince was christened George Augustus Frederick, and his arrival secured the succession of the House of Hanover. As the eldest son and heir apparent, he was created Prince of Wales within days of his birth. The future George IV would grow to be one of Britain's most extravagant and controversial monarchs. George was raised under the strict supervision of his father, who imposed a rigid education and moral discipline upon all his children. The Prince of Wales resented this control and, by his late teens, had begun to rebel against his father's austere values. He embraced fashion, architecture, and the arts with passionate intensity. He became a patron of culture and a connoisseur of luxury, spending vast sums on palaces, clothing, and entertainments that alarmed both the king and Parliament. In 1785, George secretly married Maria Fitzherbert, a Roman Catholic widow, in a ceremony that violated the Royal Marriages Act and the Act of Settlement. The marriage was legally void, but George considered it binding. A decade later, facing enormous debts, he agreed to an official marriage arranged by his father. In 1795, he wed Princess Caroline of Brunswick. The marriage was a disaster from the outset. George found Caroline personally repellent, and the couple separated shortly after the birth of their only child, Princess Charlotte, in 1796. When King George III descended into permanent madness in 1810, the Prince of Wales became Prince Regent. He governed in his father's name for the final decade of the reign, a period that saw the conclusion of the Napoleonic Wars and the Congress of Vienna. George's regency is remembered for its cultural brilliance. The era produced Jane Austen, Lord Byron, and John Nash's architectural masterpieces, but also for the Prince Regent's personal excesses and his bitter estrangement from his wife and daughter. George ascended the throne as George IV in January 1820, upon his father's death. His reign was brief and troubled. He attempted to divorce Queen Caroline through an act of Parliament, provoking a national scandal. Caroline died in 1821, and George ruled alone, increasingly isolated and unwell. He continued his patronage of the arts, completing the Royal Pavilion in Brighton and commissioning grand projects at Windsor Castle and Buckingham Palace. He died at Windsor on June 26, 1830, aged 67, despised by much of the public, yet leaving an indelible mark on British culture. His only legitimate child, Princess Charlotte, had predeceased him in 1817, and his line ended with his death. Prince Frederick was born on August 16, 1763, at St. James's Palace, the second son of George III and Queen Charlotte. From infancy, it was understood that Frederick's future lay in military service. He was created Duke of York and Albany and Earl of Ulster in 1784. Unlike his elder brother, Frederick maintained a more cordial relationship with his father, though he too chafed under the king's strict moral expectations. Frederick was sent to Germany for military training and spent several years in Hanover, absorbing Prussian discipline and continental military theory. He returned to Britain as a professional soldier and was appointed to senior commands despite his relative youth. In 1787, he married Princess Frederica Charlotte of Prussia, the daughter of King Frederick William II. The marriage produced no children, and the couple lived largely separate lives, though they remained on amicable terms. In 1793, Frederick was given command of British forces in Flanders during the French Revolutionary Wars. His campaigns were marked by mixed results. He proved a capable organizer but an indifferent field commander. His forces suffered defeats and were eventually evacuated from the continent. The nursery rhyme about the grand old Duke of York who marched his men up and down a hill is believed to reference his campaigns. Despite his battlefield failures, Frederick demonstrated genuine talent for military administration. In 1795, Frederick was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the British Army, a position he would hold with one brief interruption until his death. In this role, he transformed the British military establishment. He reformed training, improved conditions for common soldiers, established the Royal Military College, and modernized the promotion system to reduce the purchase of commissions. His administrative reforms laid the groundwork for the British Army's successes in the Napoleonic Wars and beyond. Frederick's later years were marred by scandal. In 1809, he was accused of allowing his mistress, Mary Ann Clark, to sell military commissions and promotions. A parliamentary investigation forced his resignation, though he was later exonerated and reinstated. He continued his reforms until his health declined in the 1820s. Frederick died on January 5, 1827, at Rutland House in London, aged 63. He was buried in St. George's Chapel, Windsor. Having no legitimate children, his line ended with his death, but his legacy endured in the professionalized British Army he had helped to create. Prince William Henry was born on August 21, 1765, at Buckingham House in London. As the third son of George III, William was destined for the Royal Navy. At the age of 13, he was sent to sea as a midshipman, beginning a naval career that would define his youth and earn him the affectionate title of the Sailor King. William served with distinction during the American Revolutionary War and later in the Caribbean. He befriended Horatio Nelson and saw action in various theaters. Unlike his elder brothers, William experienced genuine hardship and danger, living among common sailors and learning seamanship from the deck up. His father was proud of his naval service, but their relationship remained formal and distant, constrained by the rigid protocols George III imposed on all his children. In 1790, William was created Duke of Clarence and St. Andrews and Earl of Munster. By this time, he had left active service and begun a long domestic relationship with the actress Dorothea Jordan. William and Mrs. Jordan lived together for 20 years and had 10 illegitimate children, known as the Fitzclarences. William was a devoted father to these children, and his household was famously warm and unpretentious. However, when the succession crisis emerged after the death of Princess Charlotte in 1817, William bowed to dynastic duty. In 1818, William ended his relationship with Mrs. Jordan and sought a suitable royal bride. He married Princess Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen, a quiet and devout woman 27 years his junior. The marriage was affectionate, though it produced no surviving children. 2 daughters were born but died in infancy, extinguishing any hope that William's legitimate line would continue. When George IV died in 1830, William ascended the throne at the age of 64. The oldest person to become British monarch up to that time. His reign witnessed significant political reform, including the passage of the Reform Act of 1832, which expanded the electoral franchise and reformed parliamentary representation. William initially opposed the bill, but ultimately supported it to avoid a constitutional crisis. He was unpretentious and accessible, a stark contrast to his predecessor, and enjoyed genuine popularity. William IV died on June 20, 1837, at Windsor Castle, aged 71. With no legitimate children, the throne passed to his niece, Victoria, the daughter of his deceased younger brother, Edward. William was buried at St. George's Chapel, Windsor. Though his own line ended, his 10 illegitimate children and their descendants carried his blood into the British aristocracy. Princess Charlotte Augusta Matilda was born on September 29, 1766, at Buckingham House. She was the first daughter of George III and Queen Charlotte, and the 4th child overall. As a princess, Charlotte's future lay in a strategic marriage that would cement alliances between Britain and continental powers. Charlotte spent her childhood under her mother's watchful supervision. Queen Charlotte maintained strict discipline over her daughters, and Princess Charlotte received an education appropriate to her station: languages, music, drawing, and religious instruction. She was known for her intelligence and strong will, traits that occasionally brought her into conflict with her mother's authority. In 1797, at the age of 30, Charlotte married Frederick I of Württemberg, who was then the hereditary prince. The marriage was politically motivated, designed to strengthen ties with the German state that bordered France during the turbulent revolutionary period. Charlotte's new husband was a widower, significantly older and of formidable physical size. The marriage produced one surviving daughter, Princess Catherine, but was not considered particularly happy. Frederick succeeded as Duke and then King of Württemberg, and Charlotte became Queen Consort in 1805. She adapted to life in Stuttgart and fulfilled her ceremonial duties with dignity. She maintained correspondence with her family in England, but visited rarely. Her position became more complex during the Napoleonic Wars, as Württemberg's allegiances shifted with the changing political landscape of Europe. Charlotte's relationship with her father had been warm in childhood, and George III was said to have grieved when she left for Germany. As his mental health deteriorated, Charlotte received reports of his condition but could offer little comfort from abroad. She outlived most of her siblings and witnessed the transformation of Europe after the Congress of Vienna. Princess Charlotte died on October 6, 1828, in Ludwigsburg, near Stuttgart, aged 61. She was buried in the royal crypt at Ludwigsburg Palace. Her daughter Catherine became Queen of Westphalia through marriage, and through Catherine's descendants, Charlotte's blood entered multiple European royal houses, though no direct line survives to the present day. Prince Edward Augustus was born on November 2, 1767, at Buckingham House. The fourth son of George III, Edward was destined for military service. He was sent to Germany for training and developed a reputation as a strict disciplinarian, a trait that would mark his entire military career. Edward received his own establishment and was created Duke of Kent and Strathearn and Earl of Dublin in 1799. He served in various military posts in Gibraltar, Canada, and the Caribbean. His commands were characterized by rigid discipline and harsh punishments, which made him unpopular with his troops. Mutinies occurred under his command in Gibraltar, and he was eventually recalled from active service. Despite these failures, he remained devoted to the idea of military order and reform. Like his brothers, Edward accumulated substantial debts through lavish spending. He lived for many years with his mistress, Julie de Saint-Laurent, a relationship his father disapproved of but could not prevent. However, the death of Princess Charlotte of Wales in 1817 created a succession crisis. None of George III's sons had produced legitimate surviving heirs, and a race began among the aging princes to marry and produce an heir to the throne. In 1818, Edward ended his relationship with Madame de Saint-Laurent and married Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, the widowed sister of Prince Leopold, who had been married to Princess Charlotte. The marriage was contracted specifically to produce an heir. On May 24, 1819, Edward's wife gave birth to a daughter at Kensington Palace. The infant was christened Alexandrina Victoria, and she would become Queen Victoria. Edward's relationship with his father had been distant and strained, marked by financial disputes and disapproval of his lifestyle. George III did not live to see his granddaughter, as his mental faculties had long since failed. Edward himself would not live to see his daughter ascend the throne. On January 23, 1820, Prince Edward died at Sidmouth in Devon, aged 52. He had contracted pneumonia and succumbed after a brief illness. He was buried at St. George's Chapel, Windsor. Through his daughter Victoria, Edward's line would dominate British and European royalty for more than a century. His blood flows today in virtually every royal house of Europe, including the current British royal family. Princess Augusta Sophia was born on November 8, 1768, at Buckingham House. The second daughter of George III and Queen Charlotte, Augusta was raised alongside her sisters in a household governed by strict propriety and limited social freedom. Queen Charlotte maintained close supervision over her daughters, restricting their movements and social interactions. Augusta received the standard education of a Georgian princess, languages, music, and needlework. She was intelligent and well-read, with a particular interest in music. Like her sisters, Augusta was expected to make a strategic marriage, but suitable matches proved elusive. As she passed her 20s and then her 30s, it became increasingly clear that she would remain unmarried. The reasons were multiple: her father's reluctance to lose his daughters to foreign courts, her mother's controlling nature, and the limited pool of appropriate Protestant princes. Augusta lived much of her adult life at court or in royal residences, performing ceremonial duties and serving as companion to her parents. She was known for her kindness and charitable works. Unlike some of her more rebellious siblings, Augusta maintained a dutiful public demeanor, though she privately chafed under the restrictions imposed upon her. She developed a close friendship with her sister Elizabeth and maintained correspondence with her siblings, who married abroad. As her father's mental health deteriorated, Augusta was among the family members who witnessed his decline. She felt affection for George III, but also recognized the limitations his illness and earlier strictness had placed upon her life. When he died in 1820, Augusta was 51 years old, well past any prospect of marriage or independent life. Augusta lived quietly through the reigns of her brothers George IV and William IV. She resided primarily at Frogmore House in Windsor and occasionally at Clarence House in London. She was known for her charitable activities and her support of various institutions. She avoided public controversy and maintained her dignity despite the sadness of her circumscribed life. Princess Augusta Sophia died on September 22, 1840, at Clarence House, aged 71. She was buried at St. George's Chapel, Windsor. Having never married, she left no children, and her line ended with her death. She lived to see her niece Victoria ascend the throne, witnessing the beginning of a new era. Princess Elizabeth was born on May 22, 1770, at Buckingham House. The third daughter and seventh child of George III and Queen Charlotte, Elizabeth was known for her artistic talents and amiable disposition. She was considered one of the more attractive of the royal daughters and possessed considerable skill in painting and drawing. Elizabeth's childhood was spent under her mother's strict supervision, similar to her sister's. She received an education in languages, music, and the arts, excelling particularly in visual arts. Her paintings and sketches were admired within court circles, and she maintained this interest throughout her life. Like Augusta, Elizabeth was expected to make a strategic marriage, but suitable opportunities did not materialize during her youth. As Elizabeth entered her 30s and then her 40s, still unmarried, she began to despair of ever escaping the confines of the royal household. Queen Charlotte's control over her daughters' lives remained absolute, and George III's episodes of illness made the household increasingly tense and melancholic. Elizabeth served as a dutiful daughter, attending to her parents and performing court duties, but longed for an independent life. After Queen Charlotte's death in 1817, Elizabeth gained greater freedom. The following year, at the age of 48, she finally married. Her husband was Frederick VI, Landgrave of Hesse-Homburg, a minor German prince. The marriage was contracted late in life for both parties, and it produced no children. Nevertheless, Elizabeth was reportedly happy to have finally achieved her own household and a measure of independence. Elizabeth lived in Hamburg for more than 2 decades, maintaining correspondence with her siblings and occasionally visiting England. Her marriage, though childless, provided her with the dignity and autonomy she had long desired. She was widowed in 1829 when Frederick died, but she chose to remain in Germany rather than return permanently to England. Princess Elizabeth died on January 10, 1840, at Frankfurt, aged 69. She was buried beside her husband in the mausoleum in Hamburg. Having no children, her line ended with her death. She survived most of her siblings and lived long enough to see her niece Victoria firmly established on the throne. Prince Ernest Augustus was born on June 5, 1771, at Buckingham House. The fifth son of George III and Queen Charlotte, Ernest was destined for a military career and was sent to Germany for training in his youth. He developed into one of the most controversial of George III's sons, known for his reactionary political views and his scarred, intimidating appearance. Ernest served in the Hanoverian army during the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, sustaining serious wounds in combat. A saber cut disfigured his face, and he lost the use of one eye. These injuries contributed to his fierce and somewhat sinister public image. He was created Duke of Cumberland and Teviotdale and Earl of Armagh in 1799. Ernest returned to England after the wars and became active in politics, aligning himself with the most conservative elements of the Tory party. Ernest was deeply unpopular in Britain. He opposed Catholic emancipation, parliamentary reform, and any liberalization of British institutions. Rumors and scandals surrounded him, including unproven allegations of murder and incest. These accusations were likely exaggerated or fabricated by his political enemies, but they clung to his reputation. His harsh manner and reactionary views made him a target for radical critics and the popular press. In 1815, Ernest married Princess Frederica of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, his twice-widowed cousin. The marriage produced one son, Prince George, born in 1819. Ernest proved a devoted husband and father, and his domestic life was far more conventional than his public reputation suggested. His relationship with his father had been complicated by his long absences abroad and his political independence. When William IV died in 1837 without legitimate heirs, the British throne passed to Victoria, but the Crown of Hanover could not. Hanoverian law prohibited female succession, and Ernest, as the eldest surviving son of George III, became King of Hanover. He left England and took up residence in Hanover, ruling the kingdom until his death. Ernest's reign in Hanover was marked by conflict with liberal elements. He revoked the constitution granted by his predecessor and ruled with an authoritarian hand. However, he proved an effective administrator and maintained Hanoverian independence during a turbulent period in German history. His son George succeeded him as King of Hanover. Ernest Augustus died on November 18, 1851, in Hanover, aged 80. He was buried in the royal chapel of the Lehne-Schloss. Through his son and grandson, his line continued until 1918, when the Kingdom of Hanover was dissolved after Germany's defeat in the First World War. His descendants continue today as the House of Hanover, and through them the blood of George III flows in the modern British royal family through Queen Mary, consort of George V. Prince Augustus Frederick was born on January 27, 1773, at Buckingham House. The sixth son of George III and Queen Charlotte, Augustus was known for his liberal views, intellectual interests, and defiance of royal convention. He was created Duke of Sussex and Earl of Inverness in 1799. Augustus spent much of his youth traveling in Italy for health reasons, suffering from chronic asthma. During his time abroad, he developed a love of literature, theology, and liberal politics. He collected books voraciously and eventually amassed one of the finest private libraries in Britain. His education and temperament set him apart from his more militaristic brothers, and he became the most politically progressive of George III's sons. In 1793, while in Rome, Augustus secretly married Lady Augusta Murray, the daughter of an earl. The marriage violated the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, which required the sovereign's consent for the marriages of descendants of George II. When George III learned of the marriage, he declared it void. Augustus refused to abandon his wife, and the couple lived together in defiance of the king, producing 2 children. The situation caused a permanent breach between Augustus and his father. Eventually, under pressure and legal challenge, Augustus was forced to separate from Lady Augusta, though he continued to support her and their children financially. He later entered into another invalid marriage with Lady Cecilia Underwood, whom he called the Duchess of Inverness, though she was never legally recognized as such. Augustus's domestic arrangements were unconventional by royal standards, but he remained committed to his chosen partners. Augustus became known for his liberal political views and his support for Catholic emancipation, religious tolerance, and parliamentary reform. He broke with his Tory brothers and aligned himself with Whig politicians. He was deeply interested in theology and biblical scholarship, and he served as president of the Royal Society. His home became a center for intellectual and artistic society, and he was respected for his learning and patronage. Augustus lived to see his niece Victoria ascend the throne in 1837. He supported her reign and served as a senior member of the royal family during the early Victorian period. He was known for his kindness and approachability, in contrast to some of his more austere siblings. Prince Augustus Frederick died on April 21, 1843, at Kensington Palace, aged 70. He was buried at Kensal Green Cemetery, having requested not to be buried in the royal vault at Windsor. His children by Lady Augusta Murray were never legitimized, and legally his line ended with his death. However, his descendants have continued through his son Augustus Frederick d'Este and his daughter Augusta Emma d'Este. Prince Adolphus Frederick was born on February 24, 1774, at Buckingham House. The seventh son of George III and Queen Charlotte, Adolphus pursued a military career and spent much of his life in Germany. He was created Duke of Cambridge and Earl of Tipperary in 1801. Adolphus was sent to Germany for military training in his youth and served with distinction in the Hanoverian army during the French Revolutionary Wars. He proved a competent military officer and administrator, and he maintained closer ties to Hanover than most of his brothers. His service abroad meant that he was less involved in British political controversies and avoided many of the scandals that plagued his siblings. In 1818, Adolphus married Princess Augusta of Hesse-Kassel. The marriage was arranged with an eye toward producing heirs during the succession crisis following Princess Charlotte's death. The couple had 3 children, and their marriage was reportedly harmonious. Adolphus proved a devoted husband and father, and his domestic life was stable and respectable. In 1816, Adolphus was appointed Viceroy of Hanover, serving as his father's representative in the German kingdom. He fulfilled these duties conscientiously and was well regarded in Hanover. When his brother Ernest Augustus became King of Hanover in 1837, Adolphus returned to England. His viceregal duties concluded, Adolphus lived a long life and served as a senior member of the British royal family throughout the reigns of George IV, William IV, and into the reign of Queen Victoria. He was known for his moderate political views and his dedication to military and charitable causes. He maintained good relationships with most of his siblings and was respected for his integrity and public service. Prince Adolphus died on July 8, 1850, at Cambridge House in London, aged 76. He was buried at Kew, later moved to St. George's Chapel, Windsor. His son George succeeded as Duke of Cambridge and served as Commander-in-Chief of the British Army. Through his daughter, Princess Mary Adelaide of Cambridge, Adolphus became the ancestor of Queen Mary, consort of George V. Through this line, the blood of George III flows directly in the current British royal family. Princess Mary was born on April 25, 1776, at Buckingham House. The 4th surviving daughter and 11th child of George III and Queen Charlotte, Mary would live longer than all her siblings, witnessing the transformation of Britain from Georgian to Victorian age. Mary spent her youth under her mother's supervision, receiving the same restricted upbringing as her sisters. She was educated in languages, music, and drawing, and was known for her skill in needlework. Like Augusta and Elizabeth, Mary remained unmarried through her 20s and 30s, confined to the royal household and its limited social sphere. After Queen Charlotte's death in 1817, Mary gained greater freedom. In 1816, at the age of 40, she married her cousin Prince William Frederick, Duke of Gloucester and Edinburgh. The marriage was contracted during the succession crisis. Though Mary was beyond childbearing age and the union produced no children, nevertheless, Mary was reportedly content with her marriage, having finally achieved her own establishment and status as Duchess of Gloucester. Mary and her husband lived quietly at Gloucester House in Bagshot Park. She performed ceremonial duties as required and maintained close relationships with her surviving siblings. She was present at court during the reigns of her brothers George IV and William IV, and she lived well into the reign of her niece Victoria, providing a living link to the previous century. As Mary aged, she became one of the last surviving representatives of the Georgian royal family. She remembered the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, and the entire sweep of her father's long reign. Her longevity was remarkable, and she was treated with affection and respect as a venerable figure. Princess Mary died on April 30th, 1857, at Gloucester House in London, aged 81. She was buried at St. George's Chapel, Windsor. She was the last surviving child of George III and Queen Charlotte, and her death closed the chapter on that generation. Having no children, her line ended with her death. She lived to see the industrial transformation of Britain and the early decades of Victoria's long reign. Princess Sophia was born on November 3, 1777, at Buckingham House. The 5th surviving daughter and 12th child of George III and Queen Charlotte, Sophia lived one of the most obscure and tragic lives of all the royal children. She remained unmarried and spent much of her life in seclusion. Sophia's childhood was spent under her mother's strict supervision, like her sisters. She received a standard royal education and was noted for her beauty in her youth. However, Sophia's life was marked by rumor and scandal. It was alleged that she had an illegitimate child fathered by one of her father's equerries, though evidence remains inconclusive and the truth was never publicly established. Whether true or not, Sophia lived under a cloud of suspicion and spent much of her life in virtual isolation. Sophia's relationship with her mother was particularly strained, and she lived a melancholic existence within the royal household. After Queen Charlotte's death in 1817, Sophia gained some freedom but continued to live quietly. She never married, and suitable proposals appear never to have been seriously entertained. Her life was spent largely at royal residences, particularly Kensington Palace. Sophia was known for her charitable work, supporting various institutions and causes. She maintained correspondence with some of her siblings, but avoided public appearances. As she aged, she became increasingly reclusive, troubled by poor health and near blindness. She was cared for by attendants and lived in genteel obscurity. Sophia's relationship with her father had been affectionate in her youth, but George III's mental decline meant that he was largely absent from her adult life. She outlived most of her siblings and witnessed the reigns of 3 of her brothers and her niece. Her life was marked by restriction, sadness, and unfulfilled potential. Princess Sophia died on May 27, 1848, at Kensington Palace, aged 70. She was buried at Kensal Green Cemetery, later moved to St. George's Chapel, Windsor. Having never married, she left no children, and her line ended with her death. Her life remains one of the most enigmatic of all George III's children. Prince Octavius was born on February 23, 1779, at Buckingham House. The 8th son and 13th child of George III and Queen Charlotte, Octavius was a particularly beloved child within the royal family. His brief life would become one of the most poignant chapters in George III's personal history. Octavius was described as an exceptionally charming and affectionate child. George III was particularly devoted to him, and the young prince's playful nature brought joy to the aging king. Octavius was too young to receive formal education, but he was reportedly intelligent and quick to learn. He was adored by his siblings and attendants alike. In 1783, an inoculation program was undertaken for several of the younger royal children to protect them against smallpox. The procedure involved exposure to a mild form of the disease, a precursor to modern vaccination. Most of the children recovered without incident, but Octavius fell gravely ill. Despite the efforts of royal physicians, his condition deteriorated rapidly. Prince Octavius died on May 3, 1783, at Kew Palace, aged just 4 years old. His death devastated George III, who was reported to have wept openly and struggled to accept the loss. The king was said to have been unable to speak of Octavius for months afterward without profound grief. Queen Charlotte also mourned deeply, and the entire royal household was plunged into sadness. Octavius was buried at Westminster Abbey in Henry VII's chapel. His death marked one of the king's first great personal tragedies, predating the later loss of Prince Alfred and Princess Amelia. George III kept a locket containing a portrait of Octavius for the rest of his life, and he was known to have been haunted by the child's memory during his episodes of mental illness. Prince Octavius's line ended with his death in infancy, but his brief life left an enduring mark on his father's heart and on the royal family's history. Prince Alfred was born on September 22, 1780, at Windsor Castle. The 9th son and 14th child of George III and Queen Charlotte, Alfred was a healthy infant who brought continued joy to the growing royal family. He was named after Alfred the Great, reflecting his father's deep interest in English history. Alfred's early months were uneventful. He was nursed and cared for by attendants under his parents' supervision, living in the royal nurseries alongside his siblings. The king and queen visited their children regularly, and George III was known to take pleasure in spending time with his younger sons and daughters. In 1782, Alfred fell ill. The nature of his illness was not fully documented, but it appears to have been sudden and severe. Royal physicians attended him, but medical knowledge at the time was limited, and childhood illnesses were often fatal. Despite all efforts to save him, Alfred's condition worsened. Prince Alfred died on August 20, 1782, at Windsor Castle, aged just 20 months old. His death occurred less than a year before the death of Prince Octavius, compounding the grief that would soon overwhelm George III and Queen Charlotte. Alfred was buried at Westminster Abbey in Henry VII's chapel, near where Octavius would soon join him. The loss of two young sons in such close succession was a profound blow to George III. The king struggled to comprehend these deaths, and they contributed to the periods of depression and instability that marked his later life. Queen Charlotte bore her grief more privately, but was equally devastated. Prince Alfred's line ended with his death in infancy. His brief life is remembered as part of the tragic toll that childhood mortality exacted even on royal families in the 18th century. Princess Amelia was born on August 7, 1783, at Royal Lodge, Windsor. The 15th and youngest child of George III and Queen Charlotte, Amelia was the last addition to the royal nursery. She became her father's favorite child, and her eventual death would precipitate the final collapse of his mental health. Amelia was raised under her mother's supervision, like her sisters, but she enjoyed a particularly close relationship with George III. The king doted on her and called her by the affectionate nickname Emily. She was intelligent, spirited, and musically talented. Unlike some of her older sisters, Amelia had a more open and affectionate nature, which endeared her to her father. As Amelia grew into young womanhood, she fell in love with one of her father's equerries, Charles Fitzroy. The relationship was conducted with discretion, but it was impossible to formalize. Fitzroy was not of sufficient rank to marry a princess, and George III would never have consented to such a match. Amelia and Fitzroy exchanged letters and tokens, but they could not marry. The situation caused Amelia great unhappiness. In her early 20s, Amelia's health began to decline. She suffered from tuberculosis, a disease for which there was no effective treatment. She spent time at Weymouth and other locations seeking healthier climates, but her condition steadily worsened. George III was deeply distressed by her suffering and visited her frequently, holding her hand and praying for her recovery. Princess Amelia died on November 2, 1810, at Augusta Lodge, Windsor, aged 27. Her death shattered George III. Within weeks, the king descended into his final episode of madness, from which he never recovered. He was unable to comprehend her loss and called for her repeatedly during his final years of confinement. Amelia was buried at St. George's Chapel, Windsor. Amelia left a ring to Charles Fitzroy with the inscription, "Remember me," and she left instructions that her personal effects be distributed among those she loved. Having never married, she left no children, and her line ended with her death. She is remembered as the beloved daughter whose loss marked the final tragedy of George III's reign. Of George III's 15 children, 13 survived to adulthood. 7 sons and 6 daughters navigated the complexities of royal life in an age of revolution, war, and social transformation. They sat on thrones, commanded armies, married into European dynasties, and lived out quiet lives in royal households. Yet for all their number, only 2 of George III's children established lines that survive to the present day. The first surviving line descends from Prince Edward, Duke of Kent. His daughter Victoria ascended the British throne in 1837 and reigned for 63 years. Through her 9 children, Victoria became the grandmother of Europe, and her descendants occupied thrones across the continent. Today, the British royal family descends directly from Edward through Victoria. King Charles III, his sons William and Harry, and all their children carry the blood of George III through this line. The House of Windsor, though renamed from Saxe-Coburg and Gotha during the First World War, remains fundamentally the House of Edward, Duke of Kent. The second surviving line descends from Ernest Augustus, Duke of Cumberland and King of Hanover. Through his son George V of Hanover and grandson Ernest Augustus, Crown Prince of Hanover, the line continued despite the loss of the Hanoverian throne in 1866 and the privations of 2 world wars. Ernest August, the current head of the House of Hanover, descends directly from this line. More significantly, for the British succession, Ernest Augustus's blood returned to the British throne through his great-great-granddaughter, Princess Mary of Teck, who married King George V. Queen Mary was the mother of both Edward VIII and George VI, and thus the grandmother of Queen Elizabeth II. Through this line, George III's blood flows doubly into the current royal family. The remaining children, George IV, Frederick, Duke of York, William IV, Charlotte. Queen of Württemberg, Augusta Sophia, Elizabeth Landgravine of Hesse-Homburg, Augustus Frederick, Duke of Sussex, Adolphus, Duke of Cambridge, Mary, Duchess of Gloucester, Sophia, Octavius, Alfred, and Amelia. Left no surviving legitimate lines. Some produced no children at all. Others saw their lines extinguished within a generation or two. The 10 illegitimate children of William IV with Dorothea Jordan have descendants among the British aristocracy, but they stand outside the direct line of succession. George III reigned for nearly 60 years, from 1760 to 1820. His children spanned the entire Georgian and early Victorian eras. They witnessed the loss of the American colonies, the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, the rise of industrialization, and the birth of modern Britain. As a family, they were often dysfunctional, constrained by their father's strictness and their mother's control, burdened by debt and scandal, yet they fulfilled their dynastic duties and shaped the course of British and European history. Today, more than 2 centuries after George III's death, his genetic legacy endures in the royal houses of Europe. Through Edward and Ernest Augustus, his blood flows in monarchs, princes, and princesses across the continent. The House of Hanover, which George III represented, became the foundation for the House of Windsor. The 15 children of George III, for all their varied fates, ensured that their father's line would not merely survive, but would define European royalty for generations to come. In palaces from London to Oslo, from Stockholm to Madrid, the children of George III are remembered, not merely as historical figures, but as ancestors whose blood still runs in the veins of reigning monarchs,